In the heart of Hong Kong, there once stood a place so densely packed and self-contained that it appeared from afar as a single colossal block of concrete. This was Kowloon Walled City, a breathing fortress teeming with life inside its cramped confines. The walled city began as a Chinese military outpost centuries ago, but an 1898 treaty excluded it from Britain's new 99-year lease of the new territories. The British agreed China could retain control of the fort, expecting Chinese officials to depart once colonial administration took hold. But that never fully happened. Instead, the walled city remained in a strange limbo. Within British territory but outside British law, a diplomatic no-man's land. Early on, Qing officials did briefly garrison the town, but by 1899, the last Chinese magistrates were evicted by British forces amid protests, leaving the site effectively abandoned as an official entity. For the first half of the 20th century, the old walled fort, with its stone gates and courtyard yamen, sat neglected. World War II shook the walled city from dormancy. During the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, the historic defensive walls were torn down for building materials to expand the nearby Kai Tak airfield. By war's end, the walls and Qing-era buildings were largely gone, but the enclave's anomalous political status remained. This vacuum quickly drew waves of Chinese refugees and squatters in the late 1940s, people desperate for shelter, who found that the authorities, British or Chinese, had no clear jurisdiction to keep them out. By 1947, an estimated 2,000 shacks crowded the old site. With no taxes, no visas, and virtually no police interference, the walled city became a free zone for those untormented by governments of any kind, as one writer put it. Refugees and outcasts could metaphorically get their breath back, living as they pleased, untaxed, uncounted, and largely unseen by the outside state. The enclave earned the nickname Hak Nam, or City of Darkness, partly because of its shadowy legal status, and partly because its alleyways would soon become literally sunless under growing towers of tenements. In January 1950, a catastrophic blaze swept through the settlement's makeshift huts, rendering 17,000 people homeless overnight. The fire, some whispered, might even have been intentionally set, a shadowy rumor suggesting someone sought to clear out the wooden shanties for new construction. Whether by accident or design, the disaster gave the walled city a chance to rebuild almost from scratch. What rose in place of the old shacks were taller, sturdier structures of brick and concrete, erected hastily by residents unbound by any building codes. Through the 1950s and 60s, Kowloon Walled City grew upward and outward in an organic, almost viral fashion. Small 2- or 3-story houses were gradually hemmed in and overtopped by multi-story apartment blocks. By the early 1970s, many buildings had reached 8 to 10 stories, crowding so tightly that some adjacent high-rises literally touched sides, making it impossible to open a window fully. Developers, often just resourceful inhabitants, would build new floors atop older structures, resulting in a jumbled high-rise patchwork unsupported by any formal plan. There was a practical limit to this ad hoc skyscraping. The enclave lay directly under the flight path of Kai Tak Airport, which imposed an informal height cap of about 13 to 14 stories. By the late 1970s, the walled city's profile leveled off at that ceiling, forming a tight, flat-topped cube of buildings. It occupied only 2.6 to 2.7 hectares, about 6.5 acres, yet housed an astonishing 30 to 40,000 residents by the 1980s. This made it the densest spot on Earth, a fact often repeated in awed tones by the media. From outside, it looked like a solid fortress of concrete and steel with hundreds of neon signs encrusting its outer walls, a bizarre blister of unregulated urbanity in the midst of Hong Kong. Despite appearances, this fortress breathed. It was not an empty ruin, but a functioning city within a city, alive with commerce and family life. One British journalist in 1990 described the walled city in its final years as 6.5 acres of solid building, home to 33,000 people, the biggest slum in the world. And also, arguably the closest thing to a truly self-regulating, self-sufficient, self-determining modern city that has ever been built. By the 1970s, Kowloon Walled City had electricity and water, mostly siphoned or pirated from municipal lines, schools and temples, shops and factories, even its own rudimentary mail delivery and trash collection arrangements. It was as if the absence of law and authority allowed an alternative city to crystallize in the margins of the official one. The walled city became a singular experiment in unplanned urbanism. Chaotic and squalid, yes, but also strangely harmonious in its own rough way. Like a fortress protecting its inhabitants from outside interference, it nurtured a unique community behind its walls. And like a living organism, it adapted and grew in response to the needs of those who crowded within. To understand how life thrived inside this breathing fortress, one must step through its narrow gates and leave the sunlight behind. To enter Kowloon Walled City was to pass from open Hong Kong streets into a claustrophobic world of perpetual twilight. A visitor in those days might recall the smell, a potent mix of fried food, sewage, incense from tiny shrines, and machine oil from workshops. They would recall the sounds, the drone of machinery behind thin walls, voices echoing down crowded corridors, the distant roar of airplanes overhead every few minutes. And above all, they would recall the darkness. Sunlight rarely penetrated the interior alleys of the walled city. The passageways below were so narrow and the buildings so tall that even at noon, one walked in dim artificial light. Residents strung fluorescent tubes and naked light bulbs along the labyrinthine tunnels that served as streets, so one navigated by a garish neon glow. Water constantly dripped from leaky pipes and makeshift plumbing overhead, forcing you to watch your step to avoid puddles. In places, the ceiling was a tangle of wiring, rusted plumbing, and drainage lines, some so low you'd instinctively duck. Longtime residents knew exactly where to step to dodge the worst of the dripping ceilings and leaking air conditioners. It's no wonder they nicknamed the place the City of Darkness, yet those same residents also affectionately called it a big, warm family. Inside this hive-like city block, tens of thousands of people went about their daily lives in a densely woven community. Families of 6, 8, even 10 people squeezed into cubicle apartments, often no larger than a single room. One local family, the Hyungs, recalled that their first home in the walled city in the 1960s was a single 70-square-foot room, which they shared with 7 other families in a 2-story house. There was no space for a proper table. At mealtimes, they'd set a wooden board across a sewing machine and sit on the bed to eat. In later years, the Hyungs moved into a slightly bigger flat on the 4th floor of a high-rise, but even there, basic amenities were lacking. The second house was all right, but had no taps, Ms. Hyung Yin King recounted. As the eldest daughter, I had the responsibility of hauling buckets of water from the public taps up 4 floors to the flat every day. That's why I'm so short. She laughs about it now. But this daily chore was typical in the walled city. Many buildings had no direct water supply, so residents, often children, lugged heavy water pails up slippery stairwells. Others improvised by rigging pumps and hoses to communal standpipes in the courtyards. In time, the government did install a few municipal water pipes into the city, 8 mains for the whole district. But water pressure was unreliable, and many still relied on rooftop storage tanks or wells. Every aspect of infrastructure in the walled city was similarly cobbled together. Electricity was often diverted from outside power lines with creative and illegal wiring. At night, the maze of wires that crisscrossed the buildings buzzed and sparked, powering thousands of neon signs, bare bulbs, and humming appliances. There was no centralized garbage system at first, so residents formed their own routines, piling trash in alleys for collection, and even organizing informal cleanup crews to keep pathways navigable. Sewage and drain water trickled through an ungainly network of pipes, jury-rigged along the walls, frequently leaking or clogging. It was certainly filthy in places. Puddles of oily water underfoot and rats scurrying along the dank hallways were common sights. Yet residents adapted with rubber boots and shared knowledge of the cleaner routes through the warren. Physical space was at a premium, but the community made use of every inch. Labyrinthine staircases and corridors connected the entire block of buildings, often in unexpected ways. Over time, residents punched new doorways and hatches through walls to create shortcuts to a neighbor's unit or an adjacent factory. The result was a 3-dimensional maze. One could enter a passage at street level, climb a zigzag of stairs, and emerge on a rooftop several buildings over without ever going outside. The rooftops, in fact, became the playgrounds, parks, and escape valves for the populace. Up on the interconnected rooftops, which formed a jagged skyline of water tanks, TV antennas, and clothes lines, children flew kites and played shuttlecock. Housewives hung laundry, and everyone grabbed a bit of sun and breeze that never reached the alleys below. Photographs from the late 1980s show kids racing happily across those rooftop streets, chasing soccer balls perilously close to the edges. Every 10 minutes or so, a roaring jetliner would descend toward Kai Tak Airport, so low over the walled city that it rattled windows and, as one writer quipped, nearly made its final descent festooned in laundry. Yet the residents were so accustomed to the thunder of plane engines that conversations barely paused when one passed overhead. In a sense, the constant noise was just another thread in the tapestry of daily life. Despite the dirt and darkness, there was a remarkable vitality and variety in the walled city's hive. By the 1970s and 80s, the enclave was home to hundreds of businesses, a self-sufficient microeconomy humming away independent of outside regulation. Along the narrow alleys and inside tiny shop fronts, one could find noodle factories, fishball makers, butchers, bakers, tinkers, and print shops, to name a few. Small-scale manufacturing thrived here because rents were low and no one came to enforce permits or labor laws. In one 4-story section of the city, for example, there were at various times a candy factory, a metal stamping workshop, a textile mill, and several family-run food processors all stacked atop each other. Workers might spend all day in steamy rooms grinding fish paste or pressing plastic toys, then step out into an alleyway at lunch to buy a bowl of noodles from a street hawker who cooked over a kerosene stove. The walled city's eateries, though, were locally famous. Even people from outside would venture in for a cheap, delicious meal. One legendary noodle stall down a cramped passage was renowned for its fishball noodle soup, attracting diners willing to brave the dripping corridors for a taste. The scarcity of space also bred invention. Shopkeepers built caged balconies on building exteriors to expand their floor area, essentially hanging extra rooms off the sides of structures. Looking up at the facade of the walled city, you'd see these improvised metal enclosures stacked irregularly, some filled with potted plants or storage crates, some functioning as open-air kitchens or workspaces. Among the most infamous businesses were the unlicensed dentists and doctors who operated freely in the walled city. Outside in Hong Kong, medical practice was strictly regulated. Here, anyone with some training and tools could set up a clinic. Dozens of dirty dentists offered low-cost extractions and false teeth on the second or third floors of the city's labyrinth, advertising with little painted signs. Many poorer Hong Kong residents actually preferred these clinics because they were far cheaper than licensed dentists and conveniently ignored by health inspectors. Similarly, there were unaccredited doctors and traditional herbalists treating patients with both ancient remedies and modern drugs. No questions asked. Food businesses also skirted outside law. The walled city was one of the few places in Hong Kong one could openly find dog meat on the menu in those days, as selling canine meat was illegal elsewhere. In the city's wet market, alongside vegetables and live chickens, a stall quietly butchered dogs for customers with that taste, shielded from prosecution by the enclave's legal blindness. Yet for all these unsanctioned enterprises, life inside was not the anarchy one might imagine. The residents, by and large, lived in a state of informal order, a fragile equilibrium maintained by community networks and sometimes by the very criminal groups that outsiders feared. During the height of its population boom, the walled city's residents formed a kaifong association to advocate for basic services and mediate disputes. Charitable organizations established free schools and medical clinics. For example, a missionary-funded kindergarten took in local children, and a charity dental clinic operated openly to serve residents who couldn't afford even the walled city's own unlicensed dentists. In the tight alleys, neighbors watched out for each other. People kept their doors open, and children ran down the hallway tunnels to play at a friend's home, knowing the community's eyes were on them. "We had the best times," one former resident recalled. "Everyone got along, and it was great to have so many kids to play with." There was an undeniable camaraderie born from shared living conditions. If a fire broke out or someone was in danger, others responded swiftly. They had to, for disaster in such cramped quarters would be everyone's problem. Long-term residents remember the walled city fondly as a close-knit village where people trusted one another, and outsiders, ironically, were the ones viewed with suspicion. In many ways, Kowloon Walled City functioned like a giant beehive, densely packed cells full of activity, seemingly chaotic, but with an internal structure and mutual support system. The architecture itself contributed to this sense of communal living. Because buildings were literally fused together, the traditional distinction between private and public space blurred. Corridors ran through what once might have been separate structures, effectively turning entire floors into continuous hallways. Rooftops were communal playgrounds. Even the concept of a street or address had to be reinvented. Postal workers, when they began delivering mail inside, navigated by landmarks like a known shop or temple, and residents helped guide them through the warren to the recipient's door. Indeed, Hong Kong's postal service and police eventually learned to work with local intermediaries to reach people in the city, tacitly acknowledging that the community managed its own affairs to a large extent. Perhaps most striking to sociologists and architects is how the walled city evolved into a functioning habitat entirely outside formal urban planning. Structures were modified on the fly in response to residents' needs. A stairway added here, a footbridge between roofs there, creating what one observer admiringly called an organic megastructure, continuously responsive to its users. Without blueprints or bureaucracy, the inhabitants had built a vertical village that provided for them. It was certainly not utopian. The sanitary conditions were infamously bad, overcrowding was severe, and life could be uncomfortable and dangerous in countless ways. But there was a rough balance. People found work, children went to school, families worshipped at the little temple or ancestor altars, and life carried on. Longtime resident Mr. Lam Shu Chuen once described it as our own world, free and unmanaged. where we solved our problems in our own way. For the people living there, Kowloon Walled City was simply home. It may have been dingy and crowded, but it offered familiarity, community, and a chance to make a living. There was a sense of belonging amid the chaos. And as the outside world would soon learn, the bonds forged in that unique environment were strong enough that when the time came to tear the walled city down, many residents fought bitterly to stay. By the latter half of the 20th century, Kowloon Walled City had acquired an almost mythic reputation for lawlessness and vice. To many outsiders, it was a forbidding enclave of shadowy alleys where the normal rules did not apply. A place where even the police and tax collectors feared to tread. Sensational rumors swirled about this city of darkness. Newspapers painted it as a den of iniquity, teeming with opium dens, heroin divans, smoky mahjong gambling parlors, brothels, and even restaurants serving illicit meat. It's true that at various points in its history, the walled city harbored all of those things. From the 1950s through the 1970s, powerful triad gangs, most notably the 14K and Sun Yi-on syndicates, held sway over much of the city's underworld trade. They ran illegal casinos and drug houses behind the facade of the crowded tenements. Prostitutes solicited clients in grimy upstairs flats, drug addicts shot up in back rooms, and gang lookouts monitored the warren of passages for any unwelcome intruders. Hong Kong police largely kept out or were kept out. For years, officers would only enter the walled city in large, heavily armed units, and even then only in daylight and for targeted raids. The rule of law inside the enclave was virtually non-existent. In its place, the triads enforced their own brutal order. They demanded protection money from businesses and settled disputes with knives or worse. Murders occurred that went unreported or unpunished. In 1959, one particularly brazen murder case led to a Hong Kong court asserting jurisdiction in the walled city for the first time. But by then, the criminal networks were deeply entrenched. Throughout the 60s, the city's labyrinth provided convenient cover for fugitives and illegal operations. It was said you could vanish into those alleys, and the authorities would never find you. This era cemented the walled city's fearsome legend. Hong Kong residents who didn't live there spoke of it in hushed tones. It was commonly thought of as a no-go zone, the city's own Wild West, right in the middle of Kowloon. Parents would warn misbehaving children that if they didn't straighten up, they might be sent to live in the walled city. Foreign visitors, too, were captivated by its infamy. Some dubbed it the Twilight Zone, or compared it to a scene from a dystopian film. Indeed, before it was well documented, many in Hong Kong, Chinese and expatriate alike, assumed the walled city had already been demolished years ago. So removed was it from ordinary urban life. Those who knew it still stood imagined it as a kind of living hell, post-apocalyptic, scary, crazy, in the words of one architect, conjuring images of a nightmare city beyond salvation. Yet, like many legends, the reality of Kowloon Walled City was more nuanced. By the 1980s, the wildest days of triad dominance were actually over. A turning point came in the 1970s, when the Hong Kong government, spurred by public outcry and a new anti-corruption drive, finally cracked down on vice across the colony. The Independent Commission Against Corruption had cleaned house in the police force, meaning crooked cops could no longer guarantee protection for the syndicates. In 1973 and 1974, hundreds of Hong Kong police launched coordinated raids into the walled city, over 3,500 raids in a 2-year span, resulting in some 2,500 arrests and the seizure of vast quantities of drugs. These incursions, combined with broader police pressure citywide, gradually weakened the triad's grip. By 1983, the local district commander announced that crime in the walled city was finally under control, The overt brothels and heroin stalls were largely shut down or pushed underground. Many gangsters moved out to less policed parts of the territory. The effect was that by the late 80s, day-to-day life in the walled city was relatively peaceful for ordinary residents. Numerous first-hand accounts from that time insist that if you lived there, you felt safe. The triads, while still present, kept a low profile and generally left law-abiding residents alone. They even performed a paradoxical civic role. Acting as de facto ward bosses, they helped organize volunteer fire brigades and garbage disposal in the absence of any government services. Long-term residents recall that petty crime like mugging or theft was surprisingly rare inside the walled city, perhaps because the cramped community had its own vigilant eyes and an unofficial justice administered by those same gang figures. As one resident's father, Riley, noted, "I knew of people being mugged, and generally we avoided the place after dark, but the triads actually kept things organized." It's an interesting irony. The very people who once dealt in drugs and vice also had an interest in keeping the peace in their territory. Of course, the outsider's perception took much longer to catch up to this quieter reality. Throughout the 80s, the walled city still looked forbidding to anyone peering in from the bright streets of Kowloon City outside. By the final years, with improved policing, such dangers had abated, and curious visitors, journalists, filmmakers, adventurous tourists, could explore more freely, though always cautiously. Nonetheless, the legend of a lawless labyrinth persisted in popular imagination. In truth, most residents were not criminals at all. They were working-class families and hard-working shopkeepers who simply didn't pay rent or taxes and preferred to be left alone. These residents often bristled at how their home was portrayed. In interviews, they emphasized the positive aspects. It was part of China, never belonged to Hong Kong, some older inhabitants would say with a touch of pride, alluding to the notion that they lived free of colonial rule. Others talked about the strong neighborly bonds and how outsiders just didn't understand that the walled city had its own community rules. In the end, the mythology of Kowloon Walled City, as a place of sinister shadows, was both truth and exaggeration. It did harbor crime and secrets in its warren of rooms. Deals were made, and lives were lost behind those damp concrete walls without the outside world's notice. But it also fostered human connections and resilience that outsiders failed to see. The city was as much misunderstood as it was notorious. As the 1980s came to a close, this misunderstood city was living on borrowed time. The outside world was closing in, not with an army or a police invasion, but with something perhaps more unstoppable: bureaucratic consensus. Both the British colonial government and the Chinese authorities had finally agreed on one thing regarding Kowloon Walled City: that it had to go. In January 1987, the inevitable was announced. Kowloon Walled City would be torn down. After decades of awkward tolerance, the British Hong Kong government, with Beijing's assent as part of the 1984 handover agreements, decided to extinguish the enclave that had long been an embarrassment and an anomaly. The news was met with a mix of emotions. Many Hong Kong citizens, who viewed the walled city as a notorious eyesore, welcomed it. But inside the walled city's tight-knit community, there was turmoil and grief. This place, however imperfect, was home to thousands of people, some families spanning 3 generations in its cramped apartments. They did not relinquish it easily. The government's eviction process dragged on for years, as officials negotiated compensation and rehousing for the approximately 33,000 residents and businesses there. A package worth 2.7 billion Hong Kong dollars was offered to induce people to leave. While most eventually took the money and relocated, a stalwart minority refused. protesting that no amount could replace their unique home. There were tense standoffs. In some cases, workers had to carry out holdouts and demolish around still occupied units, a slow chipping away of the city. By 1992, the walled city had finally been emptied of its last residents, some literally driven out by the advancing wrecking crews, tears in their eyes as they left. When demolition began in March 1993, it was the final act of a singular urban drama. Giant cranes and wreckers bit into the dense block of buildings, which proved stubbornly solid, a testament to the sheer amount of material packed into that space. The maze that had taken decades to grow was unmade in just under a year. Chunk by chunk, day by day, the concrete hive fell. Longtime residents returned during those months to pay respects and say goodbye. By April 1994, the Kowloon Walled City was completely gone. In its place stood a vast emptiness, soon to be filled with a public park. The transformation was almost surreal. After a century of neglect and unofficial existence, the ground on which the walled city stood was finally under full government control, to be remade into something respectable and clean. The new Kowloon Walled City Park opened in December 1995. Today, it's a peaceful Chinese-style garden with pavilions, ponds, and manicured greenery, deliberately designed to evoke the Qing dynasty era, as if to symbolically rewind the site to its origins. Here and there, the park features a few preserved relics of the old walled city. The most significant is the restored yamen, the low two-story former administrative building from the 1800s, which somehow survived the decades of surrounding chaos. It now serves as a museum and exhibit space, housing photographs and a detailed scale model of the walled city at its peak. Also preserved are remnants of the Southgate Foundation and 2 stone plaques that once marked the original entrance, inscribed with the characters for Kowloon Walled City. These were unearthed during demolition, tangible echoes of the old fort's proud past. Strolling through the tranquil paths of the park, with birds chirping and elderly folks practicing Tai Chi, one would hardly believe this was the site of that infamous labyrinth. Aside from the occasional sign or artifact, little remains in situ of the teeming city that stood here. It's a testament to how completely an environment can be erased and reinvented in Hong Kong's ever-changing landscape. Yet memory of Kowloon Walled City proves far harder to erase. In the years since its demolition, the legend of the City of Darkness has only grown, spreading worldwide through books, photographs, documentaries, and imaginative retellings. Ironically, bringing the walls down made the walled city more famous than ever. Standing in the present-day park, one might hear the distant laughter of children from a nearby playground, or the chatter of tourists examining the old yamen exhibition. It's peaceful, almost mundane. But close your eyes and imagine the same spot 40 years ago. The air heavy with smoke and cooking smells, the concrete around you vibrating as a jumbo jet roars overhead. Thousands of people living and working in an unfathomable density just an arm's length away. That contrast is what makes Kowloon Walled City's story so compelling. It was singularly extreme, the most densely populated, least governed, most self-deterministic slice of a modern metropolis the world had ever seen.